I'd like to welcome everyone. And it's good to see some very old, friendly faces of former Kennan scholars who have returned. There are a few here. Remind people to turn off your cell phones, please. And mention a couple of upcoming events. Next Monday at noon, Zhenyid Simbal, who is the Galina Starovoitova Fellow on Human Rights and Conflict Resolution, and in addition, as an internationally acclaimed documentary filmmaker, will be presenting his film Diary from the Burned Ghetto. Zhenya has won many, many awards around the world, and I'm sure this will be a compelling event. On Tuesday, May 31st at noon, the Tuesday after Memorial Day, Alex Model from Rutgers will come down to speak about President Yanukovych's first year as president in Ukraine. For those of you who follow such things, you know that Alex is not a shy, retiring critic of President Yanukovych, so I'm sure it will be a lively and thought-provoking event. The next day, on Wednesday, June 1st, Fulbright Kennan scholar Vladimir Malakhov will be speaking about immigration and social power in Russia. That'll be in the afternoon. And on Monday, the 6th, Randy Levin, Executive Vice President of the U.S.-Russia Business Council, will speak about Russia's WTO accession. We're very pleased to be presenting one of the Title VIII-supported research scholars, James Meyer. The Title VIII program is run out of the Department of State and has been in existence now since 1983 and has been fundamental in supporting Russian, Eurasian, East European studies for over a generation. And James is the latest example of the Title VIII program's successes. He teaches in the Department of History and Philosophy at Montana State University of Bozeman. He completed his undergraduate work at McGill. He earned master's degrees from both Princeton and Brown, and his PhD is from Brown. He's had a number of prestigious grants, which have allowed him to conduct research in Russia, Turkey, Azerbaijan, and elsewhere, and he is the author of several important articles. And he'll be speaking here about some of the work he's done under this particular grant. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming out to see me today. And I'd also like to thank Blair for his introduction. And of course, I'd like to thank the Kennan Institute and the Wilson Center more generally for supporting me and supporting my work as I try to transform my dissertation into a book. And it's material from this book that I'll be talking about today in a more general sense, and also at the end of my talk, attempting to link up some of the conclusions that I find in my work to issues of more contemporary concern with respect to Russia today and Islam. In October of 1905, just months after revolution had swept the Russian Empire into what would become a 12-year experiment in parliamentary monarchy, the governor of the province of Tavrida in the Crimea was bombarded with petitions bearing the signatures of Muslims from across the Crimean Peninsula. In all, more than 700 Crimean Muslims signed the petitions in which they criticized at length the leader of the Muslim Spiritual Assembly of Tavrida, Mufti Adil Mirza Karashaysky. These petitioners, who identified themselves as the Muslim population of the Crimea, these petitioners had signed their names to the bottom of several dozen letters, most of which were near verbatim copies of one another, and they had sent these petitions to the provincial governor's office in Simferopol, complaining about what they described as the Mufti's indifference, the Mufti's inactivity with respect to his administrative duties pertaining to Muslim communities in the region. During the course of the Mufti's 4 years in service, wrote these petitioners, they said that it had become completely clear that, quote, the entirety of his activity consists of nothing more than signing his name to documents of a clerical or administrative nature, unquote. The petitioners asked the governor for the right to remove Karashaysky, that is, remove their Mufti from his position and then be given the right to elect their own Mufti and put him in his place. Now, within just a few weeks after receiving this set of petitions, the governor received a second set of petitions. These arrived in November of 1905. These petitions bore a little bit more than 1,000 signatures. And these petitions took issue with the first set of petitions that were sent in to the governor a few weeks earlier. These petitioners defended the Mufti, and in particular, the second group of petitions took issue with the way in which the first group of petitioners had identified themselves. The first group of petitioners identified themselves as Muslims of the Crimea. The second group of petitioners argued that the earlier petitioners did not constitute the voice of Muslims in the Crimea, and they charged that the critics of Mufti Karashaysky had, for themselves, appropriated the name of all Muslims living in the Crimea, and they were unjustly speaking in the name of these communities more generally. As you'll see from the quotation behind me, it says there were no elections regarding this undertaking. That is to say, the first group of petitions denouncing Karashaysky. There were no meetings. There was no form of representation with regard to this issue. The petition by no means constitutes, they wrote, the will of the, quote, Muslim population of the Crimea. Instead, the project, that is to say, that first group of petitions denouncing the Mufti, was the work of only those individuals who had signed the petitions. What I'm interested in is the question of who spoke in the name of Muslim communities after 1905. In the months and years after really the beginning of the revolution of 1905, which brought in a parliament, which brought in unprecedented freedoms with respect to the formation of political parties, the ability for people to meet in public, the ability for people to publish publicly in an almost uncensored way, this introduction of mass politics into the Russian Empire in 1905 has traditionally been described in the literature as a springtime of peoples, in the words of Andreas Kapler, who's really the preeminent historian of non-Russian communities in many ways in the Russian Empire. Traditionally, 1905 has been seen as this watershed point with the beginning of even more conflict between non-Russian communities and the Tsarist state. Generally, in an older set of historiography, relations between the Tsarist state and non-Russian communities was almost entirely described in terms of conflict, in terms of an emerging sense of national awakening among these communities. Collective identity has traditionally been talked about as something very important in these communities, with the state, on the other hand, attacking these communities through programs of Russification. However, at the same time, to some extent, indeed, the narrative of conflict between these communities and the state, and indeed what I'm talking about today, Muslim communities in the state, of course, there was conflict. There was also a lot of conflict within these communities. So what I'm looking at is Muslim communities I focus mostly on 1905, but what 1905 can tell us more generally about relations between the state and Muslim communities in late Imperial Russia. And indeed, in my work, I go several decades before 1905 to look at the different sets of concerns that we see in Muslim communities, that we see in various types of Muslim community leaders, and also in the attitudes of state officials, to look at why different political stories emerged in different regions of the empires where Muslims lived after 1905. But then, like I said, I also look quite a bit at what's going on in the decades beforehand to get a better understanding of where these people were coming from, Muslim communities, Muslim community leaders, state officials, with respect to what people wanted after 1905. Now, the issue of community administration is particularly important when we're talking about not only Muslim communities in Russia, but in fact, many different sorts of non-Russian communities in the Russian Empire, because many of these communities were administered through institutions that were called spiritual assemblies or spiritual authorities, which were religious in form, but were actually largely administrative in content. So in the case of Muslim communities, what you have were Muslim spiritual assemblies, and there were 4 in the Russian Empire. There was one located in Ufa, which was responsible for much of the administration of Muslims in what was called European Russia and Siberia. There was another assembly that was based in Simferopol, which was responsible for much of the administration of Muslim communities in the Crimea. And there were 2 Muslim spiritual assemblies located in Tbilisi. One was responsible for the administration of Shiite Muslims in the Caucasus. The other was responsible for the administration of Sunni Muslims in the Caucasus. So indeed, these were not unique to Muslim communities. There were similar institutions that were created for Jewish communities in the empire, Buddhist communities in the empire, other sorts of non-Russian communities in the empire as well. And so these institutions were responsible for matters such as arbitrating disputes, keeping records, metrical books, which recorded births, deaths, divorces, marriage, the birth of children. Officials in the Muslim spiritual assemblies were also responsible for matters like mediating disputes according to a state-sponsored version of Sharia. Now, in the Russian Empire, what this referred to was mostly what we would call family law in Western legal systems. So divorce, marriage, the division of property, according to a state-sanctioned version of Sharia. These were matters that were arbitrated on the village level by a local spiritual assembly personnel, an imam or an ahund or a muezzin. These are all terms that are taken from Islamic civilization, but which the Russian state appropriated for itself and created positions for Muslim religious figures to fill in carrying out duties both for the state and for the community. So when we get to 1905, we have a situation where in some parts of the empire, namely Muslims who had been living in the territories of the Orenburg Assembly, again, European Russia and Siberia, also Muslims who had been living in the Crimea. Muslims in these regions had been administered through these Muslim spiritual assemblies since the late 18th century. When we get to 1905 and you have the emergence of mass politics and you have the opening of a parliament, the question emerges, who speaks in the name of these communities? For communities that were in many ways quite accustomed to the principle of community-wide administration with, at the top, a mufti, or in the case of one of the four spiritual assemblies, a Sheikhul Islam, again, terms that are taken from Islamic civilization, but which represent positions within the Tsarist state, indeed, in this case, within the Ministry of Internal Affairs, which is where the Muslim spiritual assemblies and the Jewish spiritual assembly, the Buddhist spiritual assembly, etc., were all located. So this is the issue, and to a large extent, that I'm going to be talking about today, how state officials viewed this question of who should be responsible for articulating the needs of Muslim communities to state officials after 1905. Do we continue to work through these Muslim spiritual assemblies? Do we look instead to this emerging political party that's speaking in the name of Muslims, and which is called Ittifak, and which I'll talk about a little bit later? Is it possible, perhaps, for this political party and the four Muslim spiritual assemblies to work together and to agree upon certain elements of reform? What's going to be the shape of these institutions of Muslim administration in post-1905 Russia? And this is a question that state officials had a lot of varying, in some cases, opinions on. This is a question that various types of Muslim community leaders, or individuals who presented themselves or who were presented by others as Muslim community leaders, had different positions on. And this is also something that non-elite Muslims had varying degrees of concern about and varying sets of concerns about as well. So it's really this trilateral way of viewing these different perspectives of Muslim community leadership after 1905 that I'm going to talk about today. I think one of the most important things to keep in mind is that there's a lot of diversity with respect to these different attitudes, and indeed there's a lot of diversity with respect to the relations between Muslims and the state more generally, both in the Russian Empire and in Russia today. And indeed, with respect to post-Soviet space more generally today as well. The Muslim communities themselves are different. State administrative practices are different. The types of institutions that were created in one region to another were different. There were no Muslim spiritual assemblies in the Northern Caucasus, for example. There were no Muslim spiritual assemblies in Central Asia, for example. The institutions were different, the people were different, the governing situation was different, and indeed relations were quite different as well. As far as state officials were concerned, as I mentioned, to a large extent, Muslims in some regions of Russia, particularly the regions where there were Muslim spiritual assemblies, European Russia, Siberia, the Crimea, the Southern Caucasus. In those regions of Russia, the state, first of all, attempted to administer Muslims through bodies that were nominally religious, but again, were also concerned with many administrative matters. And the state also sought to communicate with Muslim communities through these institutions. So, for example, in 1884, there was a large movement of Muslims from the Southern Caucasus to the Ottoman Empire. And local officials in the area really feared social dislocation that could arrive from a massive exodus of Muslim communities from one area. So what state officials in the Southern Caucasus did was they spoke to Mufti Gaipov, who was the leader of the Sunni Muslim Spiritual Assembly in the Caucasus, and asked him to pass a circular on to a lower level of spiritual assembly officials in the Caucasus, who then circulated this circular to an even lower level of spiritual personnel working at the village level, who then read the circular in the mosque on Friday before the Friday prayers. And events like this took place, to a great degree, repeatedly throughout the 19th century, in all of the regions where Muslim spiritual assemblies were created. In the Volga-Ural region, there was incredible unrest against various measures that were taken by state authorities in the late 19th century. Again, in that case, the strategy of state authorities in dealing with Muslim communities and passing their messages on to Muslim communities in the area was to speak to them through these Muslim spiritual assemblies. In 1905, after there had been fighting between Armenians and Muslims in the Southern Caucasus, which had really begun in late 1903, Muslim spiritual assemblies, and indeed the Armenian assembly in the Southern Caucasus as well, they were charged with A, distributing relief to Muslim communities, and B, coming up with the names of delegates to sit in on tripartite talks that would be held between Muslims and Armenians and the Tsarist state. So these institutions, whereas up until 1905, were really responsible for much of the one-way communication going from the state to Muslim communities. In 1905, state authorities in Russia sought to transform the Muslim spiritual assemblies from one-way communication devices into two-way communication devices. So, chairman of the Council of Ministers, Sergei Vite, contacted in early 1905 the heads of the 4 Muslim spiritual assemblies and asked them to come up with ideas for the reform of Muslim administration in Russia post-1905. So what state authorities wanted after 1905, both in St. Petersburg and in the various regions where Muslim communities lived, wherever there was a Muslim spiritual assembly, the preference for dealing with Muslim communities post-1905 was state administrative structures of one sort or another. What state authorities in 1905 did not want was large-scale participation of non-state actors. Indeed, state authorities have been working for a long time, even on an individual basis, with the various muftis and the Sheikhul Islam. These were people who were known to Tsarist bureaucrats as officials that they could work with in one sort or another. And so the preference was really to continue to work with these state officials in 1905 and have the heads of the Muslim spiritual assemblies determine the direction for reforming Muslim communities. Meanwhile, in 1905, you also see a lot of activity taking place among various types of Muslim community activists. Now, these are the figures who have traditionally received most of the attention. These are some of them here. You have Ismail Gasprinsky, who's quite well known in the historiography up at the top. You have Yusuf Akhtra there on the right-hand side, in the middle. Various other figures from this pantheon of heroes that I found in one of the archives I was working in before. And these are individuals who had become quite active in the late 19th century with respect to Muslim cultural reform within Muslim communities, which is known as Jadidism in the historiography of Muslims in late Imperial Russia. Jadid is the Arabic word for new, and these were individuals really who promoted literacy and opening up different types of schools. Adib Khalid has written a lot about Jadidism in Central Asia. It's been quite a popular topic in the historiography for quite some time. And in 1905, many people who had been involved in these Muslim cultural reform movements in the late 19th century became active in organizing a Muslim political movement in 1905 as well. And the relationship between, and the purpose behind this movement, which was known as Ittifak, was to create a Muslim political party, a party that could represent Muslim interests, not necessarily in the back rooms dealing one-on-one with state administrators, which was the style of these Muslim spiritual assembly figures who were themselves state officials. The strategy of these Muslim community activists who became quite well known, especially in 1905 and beyond, their strategy was to create a political party, work in parliament, and they really took the idea of political reform in the Tsarist state quite seriously, work through parliament, and through parliament find ways of improving or reforming the administration of Muslims. So the relationship between the people who were involved in this Muslim political movement, their relationship with the leaders of the Muslim spiritual assemblies was complicated. On the one hand, they worked together. On the one hand, people like Gasprinsky or Akhtar or the others who were involved in this Muslim political movement, they themselves appealed to Mufti Sultanov, who was the Mufti of the Orenburg Assembly, which was responsible for European, Russian, Siberian, which he was in many ways the most influential of the four Muslim spiritual authority leaders at the time. They talked to him extensively. Mufti Karashaysky of the Crimea, the individual who was being criticized in the petitions when I started speaking today, he also, despite the rather acrimonious relationship that he sometimes had personally with Muslim community activists in the Crimea, he also intervened at times on their behalf in dealing with Muslim state officials, with Tsarist state officials. So, to a certain degree, the spiritual authority leaders and Muslim community activists worked together, but there were also a lot of difficulties as well. In particular, there was a lot of jealousy and concern among Muslim community activists over the relationship between the leaders of the Muslim spiritual assemblies and state authorities. There was a lot of fear among Muslim community activists, the people who were involved in Ittifak. There was a lot of fear that the more cozy relationship that the spiritual assembly leaders had with state authorities would lead to the Ittifak movement being really effectively cut out of the negotiations later on. In particular, the leaders of Ittifak were interested in strengthening the institutions of Muslim administration. They were interested in strengthening the administrative autonomy of the Muslim spiritual assemblies, but also the leaders of Ittifak, these community activists, were also very interested in finding a way of choosing the leadership of these assemblies themselves. So pretty much everybody was on board with the idea of strengthening the administrative autonomy of these bodies, of the Muslim spiritual assemblies. But when we got to the question of how new leaders might be chosen, what that system would be, up until 1905, it was always the Minister for Internal Affairs who was responsible for this. But in 1905, it looked for a while like Ittifak might be able to in effect, seize control of these organizations through their efforts in Parliament. And this was something that created a lot of acrimony, not only between the leaders of Ittifak and the leaders of the Muslim spiritual assemblies, who could find themselves out of a job after a while, but also created, to varying degrees in varying places, in various places, acrimony between the leaders of Ittifak and Muslim communities more generally outside of this elite leadership structure, because indeed, in many cases, Muslims had some degree of trust, some degree of familiarity with the Muslim spiritual assemblies. Indeed, as I mentioned, some of these assemblies had been created in the late 18th century. They had established institutional roots in some parts of the empire, less so in other parts of the empire, not at all in certain parts of the empire, like the Northern Caucasus and Central Asia, where these institutions didn't exist at all. As far as non-elite Muslims go, then, to continue with that, what you have is outside of a narrow group of Muslim community activists. In some parts of Russia, you saw relatively little concern with state institutions at all. In the Southern Caucasus, there was a small group of individuals, often the individuals who have gotten a lot of the attention over the years in the historiography, Muslim community activists who were very much concerned with the future of Muslim spiritual assemblies in the Southern Caucasus. But in other parts, in the Southern Caucasus, for example, it was quite narrow, though. Outside of that group of generally well-educated, often Russian-speaking Muslims who read the Russian papers, who were more involved with the terminology and vocabulary of parliamentary politics and constitutionalism, you see that, but not so much among a broader group of Muslims who are outside of this relatively tiny circle. However, in the Crimea, and even to a greater extent in the Volga-Ural region, where these institutions were older, and indeed, if you look especially at the Volga-Ural region, which first became part of the Russian Empire in the mid-16th century, where Muslims, including large numbers of non-elite Muslims, had much more of a history in dealing with the Tsarist state and in dealing with Tsarist state institutions and in dealing specifically with state institutions of especially Muslim administration, like these Muslim spiritual assemblies. In a region like that, there's a large group of Muslims who do care about state institutions, who do have opinions, who do feel that they have something at stake in the ways in which these institutions are going to be run after 1905. And there's a lot of suspicion about the leadership of the Ittifak party, a lot of suspicion towards these Muslim community activists who, in the eyes of many Muslims, and justifiably, see the Ittifak movement as seeking to take over the institutions of Muslim administration. So in many ways, 1905 offers us a snapshot of the various types of relations that are taking place more generally between state authorities, Muslim communities, and Muslim community leaders with respect to not only the question of Muslim community leadership, but also these relations between the state and Muslim communities more generally. In the Volga-Ural region, the issue of who runs the Muslim spiritual assemblies was a really politicized issue outside of a group of elites. Indeed, by the time we get to 1908, 1909, there are quite large-scale denunciation campaigns taking place in the Volga-Ural region against the leadership of the Ittifak party. Indeed, hundreds of petitions coming into state officials in 1908, 1909, defending the leaders of the spiritual assembly, Mufti Sultanov in particular, because he was the leader of the assembly that was responsible for that era. And a lot of criticism, indeed, of the leaders of the Ittifak party. But this is something that we shouldn't generalize to all of Russia. In the Crimea, where as late as 1902, you see large waves of emigration of Crimean Muslims to the Ottoman Empire. Indeed, from 1902 right up until 1905, a couple 100,000 Muslims leave at that time. There's less attachment among non-elites to what these state institutions mean. There's less attachment to state authorities themselves. In in the southern Caucasus, where you have, where it's mountainous, where indeed many Muslims would go a long time without even seeing a member of the civil authority of the Russian government. There's even less of a sense of attachment to the state. So what 1905 and the months and years afterwards show us is, on the one hand, there are a lot of divisions taking place within Muslim communities. It shows us the degree to which Muslims in some parts of the empire, particularly the Volga-Ural region, had internalized to a degree and identified to a degree with state institutions responsible for their administration. But it also shows us the degree to which in other parts of the empire, the extent to which Muslims were really concerned about state institutions, and where the question of how Muslims fit into state administration after 1905 was really more of a narrow concern, something that didn't necessarily interest a broader community of Muslims outside of a smaller group of community activists. But regardless of the number of Muslims who were involved in these questions in the Caucasus, the Crimea, Volga-Ural region, or elsewhere, everywhere you look, you see significant divisions within Muslim communities. And everywhere you look, you see various types of coalitions taking place after 1905 between Muslims and non-Muslims. In fact, where Muslims were politicized the most, you see after 1905, in some instances, one coalition of Muslims and non-Muslims facing off against another coalition of Muslims and non-Muslims. So this more traditional historiography that we have of the Russian Empire breaking into groups after 1905, sure, there were groups, but the groups were not always contiguous to national or religious parameters. Within communities, within religious groups, within nations, if you will, we see a lot of fractures and a lot of divisions. And what people in the parts of the empire where people were most used to, where people were most accustomed to state administration, what people were ultimately concerned with was not collective identity. It was policy. It was boring administrative issues. It was institutions. It was the laws and rules under which they lived. Now, if you live in a part of the empire where you never really saw very many people in state administration, then that concern is going to be a little bit less. But if you live in a part of the empire, say like the Volga-Ural region or other parts of European Russia, and to a lesser degree in the Crimea as well, where these institutions were also quite old, in those places you see considerably more concern for how this is going to happen. So what you have after 1905 isn't so much the division of Muslims and Russians across civilizational fault lines that one can often conclude from reading much of the historiography that's written about it, but instead a concern over policy and the various types of relations that state authorities and Muslim communities had after 1905 were to a large extent the result of various sets of policies. You treat people one way, and they'll often respond in one way. You treat people a different way, and they'll often respond in quite a different way and have a different feeling of connection to the state. So very briefly, because I think I've talked way too long, how this connects to issues that might be of concern today. In the 1990s, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, there were two republics, Muslim republics in Russia, that declared their independence from the Russian Federation. One was Chechnya and Ingushetia, and the other one was Tatarstan. And really the history of those two republics within the Russian Federation really in many ways couldn't be more different since then. in fact, what we've seen in Tatarstan, which first declared its independence, then suspended this declaration, then continued to suspend this declaration, and now it's largely a forgotten item. You see politicians like Shaimiev, who is the president of Tatarstan until recently, folks who grew up in the Soviet system. Shaimiev was an apparatchik under Brezhnev. He was a nationalist under Yeltsin. He became a Putinite under Putin. You see individuals like this who, on the one hand, can seem like chameleons almost with respect to their politics over the years, but you also see, maybe individuals like that are really necessary if you're going to have compromise, if you're going to have peace, if you're going to avoid a situation like the situation that we had in Chechnya. So I would say that without question, diversity with respect to the relationships between the leadership in Russia, Muslim communities in the Russian Federation, Muslim communities in the post-Soviet world more generally, shouldn't be based, our analysis shouldn't be based on who's Muslim and who isn't, but on the specifics of policy. And when we start looking into these specifics, we start seeing very different relations and very different relations that have a very long historical background. So I think I'm going to leave my comments at that and open things up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me begin, James, just by asking you to put the story you just told about Muslim communities within a broader context of changing historiography about the late Tsarist period. It seems to me that the story you just told is being told about other elements of Russian society as well, about trade unions, about local government, about national groups, about different religious groups, about city dwellers, different classes, that it now is becoming increasingly clear that in that there were asymmetrical, the imperial state relied on asymmetrical policies in dealing with a complex empire and society, and that in 1905 you begin to get engagement, and when you get engagement, you get a wide variety of responses from people who believe it is possible to cooperate with the imperial order, all the way to trade unionists, Muslims, whatever, who think that it's absolutely impossible. So I want to ask, what are the distinctive characteristics about your story that make it different from this general pattern that's emerging in the historiography?
Wow, thank you. Well, indeed, I tend to look more at my story more in terms of commonality with the broader story of late imperial Russia more generally. I tend to focus more on, ethnic and religious groups rather than organizations like trade unions. But I think, in particular, what my story tells, and which I think we can see to a large degree in late imperial Russia more generally after 1905, is that, among a lot of people, and indeed with Muslims, I think to a greater degree than perhaps with Russians, ethnic Russians, is that the politically active Muslims tended to be people who identified in one way or another with state institutions. There wasn't a large Muslim radical political movement. The Muslims in Russia who were not terribly optimistic about changes taking place in 1905, those tended to be Muslims who were disengaged from the political process more generally. Even Muslims who were considered to be radicals by state officials after 1905, they were people who had very, limited aims for the most part, and who sought, who were basically concerned with administrative issues. They were concerned with institutions. The petitions that are sent from Muslims who later split off into various types of political groups, but the petitions that you see very early throughout 1905. they're concerned about the status of Muslims in the army. They're concerned about the status of Muslims, working through working in the courts. They're concerned about the status of Muslims in the spiritual assembly, how to elect the leaders. There's a concern with institutions. The people who don't care about those institutions are generally not involved in Muslim politics at the time. And you don't see a large movement of Muslims who are active in politics, but who really are seeking to overthrow the order or to dramatically revise it. But I think it's important to look at 1905 not only as a fragment point, for the Russian Empire more generally along national or religious lines, but also look at 1905 as the beginning of a period of optimism, which didn't last. Certainly after the third Duma is closed, new electoral laws are brought in, and Muslims from Central Asia and the Northern Caucasus are disenfranchised. It's at that point that Muslims, in a more general sense, start to lose hope that they can actually change anything through a political party. And it's at that point that you see people starting to talk more about identity. Why are they talking about identity? There's nothing left. They've lost their opportunity to really change things administratively. But for as long as there's a hope of changing things through parliament, through the reforms, through dialogue, with a government, with Sergevite, who was seen as by many Muslims, both in the spiritual assemblies and in Ittifak, as someone that they could work with. For as long as that possibility exists, large numbers of Muslims are interested in engaging the state.
Okay. We only have about 15 minutes, and we have lots of questions, so I'm going to take them in batches. First, we'll take Vladimir, Will, and Heather. Will come back, and then we'll go back.
Two questions, if you don't mind. First, you mentioned that these state-sponsored Muslim organizations were more about administration than about religion. Would it be appropriate to claim that it is more or less the same case in contemporary Russia? And another question, I think you made a very strong point when you talk that the divisions within the society under the Tsar regime were not along the civilizational lines, Christians versus Muslims and so on, but more on policy lines or political lines, if I understood it correctly. Could you please say a little more about it, illustrate it maybe?
Okay, Will?
I know you focused on 1905, but I was curious if you just update things up through 1917. You talk about the focus on these state institutions, and do these state institutions survive after February, or do they find out that they have very limited roots and people become more political?
And Heather?
I was interested in what is the community. So you ask who speaks for it, but what is it? Is it the village? Is it regional? Is it defined by the state, or is it defined by the parameters of that particular spiritual assembly? And then within that, you very much do a good job of saying fragmentation is too simplistic a story for after 1905, but you never discuss creation. So it offers opportunities for the political crafting of a broader community, and Gasparinsky speaks for this. So I wonder, that ties in again to the first question, what is the community, and what are the visions for that community?
Okay, James, and keep in mind we still have lots of questions after.
Sure, okay. Vladimir, let's see. So first you asked about administration and faith, I see here. Okay, I'm going to answer your second question first because I remember it. You asked, yes.
The first one was parallels with today.
Right, yeah. So, no, I wouldn't say there are parallels with today so much. To a much lesser degree, there is a state muftiate. There are state muftis in Russia today as well. but they're not really responsible for the administration of Muslims. I mean, if you wanted to get a divorce, you don't work through that institution in Russia today, whereas you would have to back then. If you want to register in a community, or if you have problems with the registration in a community, that's not something that you would deal with the religious authorities today. So the religious authorities today in Russia, I'd say, are much more symbolic. They're not without value, not without importance, but they don't have the administrative impact on people's lives. The second question, I believe you also asked to illustrate, how exactly these weren't just religious institutions, but administrative institutions. Well, the things that I was talking about right there. I mean, marriage, divorce, division of property, being registered somewhere. These were all administrative issues that the religious authorities or the spiritual authorities were responsible for. So it's not right to say that there was, this had nothing to do with religion. I mean, they were operating under somebody's conception of Sharia. But where religion ends, where administration begins, that's a very blurry line. And I can't dissect it, but I think it's important to see the dual role of these assemblies, because they were very much about administration, not only faith. Will, you ask about the future of these institutions after 1917. Indeed, in the Soviet Union, there was also a muftiate as well. Many of these Muslim community activists, those who were also members of the state ulema in the Imperial era, some of them went on to play important roles in these administrative forces. But again, as is the case today, I mean, they really lost their administrative role in people's lives, continued to exist. Indeed, in Central Asia, a new body was created during World War II. But, this was something, an organization that did more in terms of foreign relations, the publication of some books, looking after some Muslim religious institutions, but they didn't have the administrative role that they had in the Russian Empire. What is the community? Very good question. Now, and indeed, that's a question that's really, in many ways, at the heart of my work. You do see individuals like Kasprinsky and Akhtra and Agaev. I mean, these same individuals who are best known for their role in articulating various types of identity, whether it's a type of nationalism or pan-Turkism or pan-Islamism or whatever, are also individuals who are most closely involved in politics of various sorts, whether it's politics within their communities, whether it's politics, in working in the Duma and Parliament. I think a lot more needs to be done, and what I'm doing as an element of my work, that's why I think a lot more needs to be done, on looking at these invocations of identity as forms of political speech, particularly up until 1907, when various individuals are talking about the community. You don't see Kasprinsky always talking in terms of pan-Turkism. You don't see that with Akhtra. You see individuals, Ağaoğlu as well, Ahmet Ağaoğlu, famous figure from the Southern Caucasus. One day he's talking about Caucasian Muslims, one day he's talking about Shiites, one day he's talking about the Muslim world, one day it's the Turkic world, one day it's Russian Muslims. They're trying to get people involved. They're trying to get people to care. And to a certain extent, I think, they're also trying to claim for themselves a mantle of community leaders. But how exactly that community is to be defined, that's something that people talk about in different ways. When talking to state authorities, though, they're usually talking about the community in terms of the Muslim spiritual assemblies, which do have boundaries, which do have parameters, which do have centers of administration. It's something more concrete. But after 1907, when you see Akhtra, Ağaoğlu, Hüseyinzade Ali, other famous Muslim figures go to the Ottoman Empire, you see other folks like Kasprinsky stay in Russia, then you start seeing more of what an older generation of scholars saw more as the theorizations of identity. But that's at a point really when politics is no longer there, and the politics of nuts and bolts and institutions and of actually changing people's lives is replaced by the politics of identity, where that's really all there's left to talk about.
Okay, we're really getting short on time. I'm going to go to Kathy and Thomas. Was there anybody else? We'll take these questions and then we'll wrap up.
Two quick questions. One, what did the Russians do in terms of administration in the North Caucasus and Central Asia? And I assume they did not establish them there because the directorates or spiritual assemblies there, because they were recently joined to the empire, to put it mildly. The other question is that today the spiritual directorates seem to be largely in the realm of theology. So that has a very different impact on the Muslim communities.
And Thomas?
My name's Thomas Grindley. This question is about the involvement of Muslims in the political process. In the period between 1905 and 1917, Kerensky became a significant figure. Is he, or the party he represented, on record as saying anything about the Muslim communities? And did Lenin, who after all went to the University of Kazan, have any opinions about them?
Any other questions? Okay.
All right. In the Northern Caucasus and in the Kazakh steppe, you saw adat, traditional law, as opposed to Sharia that was created. So there were similar types of institutions, but they weren't religious. They were legal systems that were based upon what was considered to be, an acceptable state-sponsored version of traditional types of arbitrating disputes among the communities of the Northern Caucasus and in the Kazakh steppe as well. Although there were various proposals among state officials to create a Muslim spiritual assembly for the Northern Caucasus, they didn't come into fruition. There was a proposal by VIII in 1900 to create Muslim spiritual assemblies in Central Asia that never came to fruition. In Turkestan, Turkestan was ruled as a colony of the Russian Empire rather than integrated into the empire the way that the Caucasus and these other places I'm talking about were. In Central Asia, they had a pre-existing system of Sharia courts that was that continued to exist and which had a relatively low level of state involvement, although they had some state officials who were checking things and monitoring things. But they didn't have the state-based system of Muslim spiritual assemblies in Central Asia of the sort that they had in these other regions of the empire that were more thoroughly integrated into the administrative system. And as far as Kerensky and Lenin are concerned, it's a little bit beyond what I'm doing. I really have no idea as far as Kerensky is concerned. Lenin's concerned, though, I mean, Lenin is somebody who took the idea of nationalities very seriously. In Baku, shortly after Azerbaijan is incorporated into the Soviet Union, they have the Congress of Peoples of the East. There was, and indeed, as I mentioned earlier, many of these Muslim community activist figures who'd been involved in things in the late Imperial age found themselves in positions of administrative authority and cultural authority in the early years of the Soviet Union. Many of them were liquidated in the 1930s, along with a lot of the other original Bolsheviks. But Lenin was somebody that a lot of these figures felt that they could work with in the early years, at any rate. But I couldn't tell you about Kerensky. I don't know.
Thank you, James. I'm going to bring it to a close. I think you've given us an important reminder of how complex Russia is and how historical phenomena that appear a little bit strange today actually have historical bases, and I think that that's very important. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you for coming.